Dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans, the Miami Grand Prix is just around the corner, but the big bang happened a little before the media day in Miami. On Wednesday, Red Bull officially confirmed that Adrian Newey would be leaving the team. The press release that we had all been waiting for came at 11 o'clock because, yes, it was no longer a surprise. You have certainly seen our video from last week. It was really only a question of when and how exactly Newey will leave Red Bull. Since the press release, we can also say a little more about the modalities. An era will end in Milton Keynes in the first quarter of 2025, when Adrian Newey will leave Red Bull Racing and also Red Bull Technologies, because until then, he will be doing less and less in Formula One, will only be on site occasionally, but he will be all the more concerned with the RB17 project, RB17. That is the Formula One car that did not come onto the track due to the corona pandemic. There was then the RB16B due to the frozen cars, and then the RB18 again. The RB17 will be a hypercar that Red Bull sells to customers, and it is the second hypercar that Adrian Newey has actually designed for Red Bull. The first was the Aston Martin Valkyrie. Well, then Aston Martin and Red Bull fell out a bit. Then it was a pure Aston Martin project at the end, so now it's the second hypercar. Newey is leaving. So Red Bull is once again without Newey's hypercar? No. That's what the negotiations were about, or extremely so, that this won't happen. So the main task of Adrian Newey, the design genius of Formula One, is now to complete this project and bring it to the market, and then he will leave Red Bull. I said it, this is the end of an era. Newey has been with Red Bull since 2006. He has shaped the racing team like no other, and the farewell PR talks about new challenges that Adrian Newey is looking for. Yes, the farewell PR is surprisingly friendly, you could say, and Newey also thanks Christian Horner, which of course raises the question of how far this whole Horner affair was responsible for Newey no longer having any desire for Red Bull racing. Horner has recently made it clear time and again that you are not dependent on individual people and so on, which obviously didn't go down too well with Adrian Newey, but Newey still thanks Horner in PR. Now you can ask yourself the question, why? Is that really the truth? Such PRs can of course be controlled wonderfully. Some people also believe that this was agreed so that Newey doesn't have an eternally long gardening leave, so that he is then free for the competition more quickly, i.e. for possible new challenges, as he himself has said. Another very interesting point in Newey's farewell quote is that he thanks his manager Eddie Jordan. To be honest, that was new to me. I didn't know that Adrian Newey was managed by Eddie Jordan, and Eddie Jordan is also the founder of the former Formula One team of the same name, which is now Aston Martin. And that's where it gets interesting when we link all of this together, new challenges. Eddie Jordan once founded Team Silverstone and Team Silverstone Aston Martin, which is now also attracting Adrian Newey, as there have been more and more rumors recently. There is definitely money now for the design genius. Lawrence Stroll, I think if there's one thing he has no shortage of, it's money. The new factory is now finished. A new wind tunnel will soon go online, so the infrastructure is also being created, and the whole thing is not far from Newey's current home in England, which could always be an issue with things like this, and Fernando Alonso drives for Aston Martin. Newey recently said in a podcast that he would have loved to have worked with Fernando Alonso at some point in his career. He could make up for that now. Yes, Aston Martin is an option, but the more likely option is Ferrari, because he said in the same podcast that he was 20 years younger and would still like to work for Ferrari. Okay, he's not 20 years younger now, but the possibility of still working for Ferrari is still there, and with Lewis Hamilton. That was the second driver he mentioned who will drive for Ferrari in 2025, and then he could kill two birds with one stone, Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton was of course asked about this on the media day. He said, well, if he had a list of priorities and people, Adrian Newey would be right at the top. The big question that was asked, of course, was Lewis Hamilton already aware of this possibility before he signed with Ferrari? He himself didn't want to say anything about it. He kept blocking it. Charles Leclerc, who would also benefit from Newey, has also praised him to the skies. All in all, it has to be said that Newey was the dominant topic on the media day, and that of course shows the importance of a design genius. So I have rarely heard an engineer talked about as much as Newey is now, and Fernando Alonso of course also spoke very highly of him and said that no matter how it all turns out, he has already secured an Aston Martin Valkyrie, which he wants to have in the garage. So there will be a piece of Newey for him one way or another. All the more surprising then that the design genius of modern Formula One doesn't seem to be an issue at Mercedes at all, even though they probably need this design genius more than ever. George Russell actually gave him a relatively clear rebuff, saying that Mercedes is the most successful team of the last 15 years in Formula One, and the engineers who were at work there are still at work now, so he has full confidence in the current people. The whole thing is, of course, all the more strange when you think, okay, Mercedes is not really getting going, and Mercedes wants Max Verstappen. And that is the next big question that comes up. Not just where does Adrian Newey go, but where does Max Verstappen go, or does he go anywhere at all? This is, of course, the elephant that has been floating around for weeks or months, ever since the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, when Max Verstappen officially stated that his future was somehow linked to Dr. Helmut Marko. The big shakeup at Red Bull Racing has not yet occurred as a result of the affair surrounding Christian Horner. Now the question is Adrian Newey's departure a consequence, yes or no? And could there be further departures at Red Bull Racing? The most prominent would of course be Max Verstappen. As I said, it has become quiet about the whole Verstappen issue, but of course he had to comment on it in the course of the Newey farewell. On the one hand, on the subject of Newey, he found it a bit difficult to really say anything. On the one hand, he didn't want to alienate Red Bull, but on the other hand, he didn't want to somehow talk down Adrian Newey's monument. He says, well, there's a whole team involved. Newey has also taken on a different role in recent years, so not much will change in terms of day-to-day operations for the time being. But will anything change for Verstappen? He says not at the moment, but this at the moment is something he always adds when asked about it. He says the media makes stories out of it. We plead guilty because they often don't understand exactly what Adrian Newey has been doing at Red Bull recently. Well, they don't tell you exactly what he's doing. I think that's also a pretty big company secret. Nevertheless, he will certainly still have been involved in Formula One. You probably only need to do a little research into the budget cap to see that Adrian Newey definitely plays a role for the Formula One team. Yes, but Max Verstappen sees his future at the moment, there it is again, at Red Bull. Is he possibly being lured away by things other than performance? He says, well, I earn enough. So that is also a statement from Max Verstappen. He says that performance is crucial and he believes in the current project, which is Red Bull Racing. You shouldn't stop a traveler, and that's how Max Verstappen feels about Adrian Newey. He says, well, if he's made his decision, then there's no need to stop him. That's the way it is. But of course, it's a shame, as he has emphasized several times. If he had the choice, he would have liked to keep Adrian Newey at Red Bull Racing. He then also, yes, perhaps chose the somewhat unfortunate expression with a second family in the team. Then, of course, came the inevitable follow-up question from a colleague, well, how is the atmosphere in this second family at the moment? And then came another telling statement from Max Verstappen, who said that everyone is very focused. It's not quite this family atmosphere, but it also shows that in the end it's performance that counts, and performance is currently so clearly in Red Bull's favor and not at all in the direction of Mercedes. Well, for 2026, that's the big question, what will happen then? But Max Verstappen believes that Adrian Newey is already too late, because if he leaves Red Bull in the first quarter, well, most of the car for 26 will already have been made. You know, the Formula One engineers are always very, very early, even if there are certain restrictions on the development for the 2026 cars. Nevertheless, when you start in the second half of the year for the new team, you can no longer have much influence on the 2026 car. Mercedes, Max Verstappen, performance decision. What could be more fitting than our latest print edition? The chronology of failure. I think Max Verstappen will feel a little less like Mercedes when he reads it. Lost in space to go with this beautiful cover. Yes, great Mercedes stories. First the chronology of failure, then we look at the causes. So if you haven't got it yet, ab.motorsport-magazin.com. Of course, it's not just Mercedes, there are many more. Take a look for yourselves. We are in Miami, but we are also talking about the last race weekend from China because there was still a lot to talk about. At least with Daniel Ricciardo, as he announced, he was furious after he was shot down by Lance Stroll behind the safety car and said, well, if Stroll still sees it that way 2 weeks later, i.e. that he is an idiot and so on, then he'll really spill the beans. There was no discussion between the two, as Daniel Ricciardo confirmed. Lance Stroll didn't really want to say that. He was sitting in a press conference and was as taciturn as ever. Daniel Ricciardo, on the other hand, told us that no, there was no discussion. However, he has calmed down somewhat compared to the statements he made in China. Well, he doesn't think he wants to have a conversation now because he doesn't think it will lead to anything with Lance Stroll. Also a very telling statement, actually. Anyone who gets Daniel Ricciardo to do that must have done a lot. But if Lance Stroll really wants to apologize to him, then Ricciardo says, well, then he will accept the apology from Lance. He is not that big an asshole. Literal quote from Daniel Ricciardo. But China is still lagging behind him, even if he has calmed down a bit mentally. Plus, 3 grid positions, yes, after there was a small revenge case against Nico Hülkenberg, whom he overtook on his own authority during the safety car phase. The stewards didn't like that at all and handed him a 3-place grid penalty. Ricciardo says, well, he should know the rules better. His mistake, on the other hand, he was a bit disappointed that the whole thing was seen so one-sidedly. And we're going back to China, but now in a different case. We are now going into the sprint and not even the Grand Prix. You see, it's all getting a bit confusing again in Formula One because there is still a right of review. Aston Martin is contesting the penalty against Fernando Alonso from the sprint. What penalty? Wait a minute, what was that? He was given 10 seconds, which didn't change his result at all because he retired from the race, but the sprint was still scored, so it didn't actually change the result at all. Yes, he got 3 penalty points, maybe that's the point. Fernando Alonso didn't want to say anything about it yet. He said, well, it all has to come to the table. The whole thing will be discussed again on Friday. First of all, it has to be established whether there is new and significant evidence. That's for the stewards to decide. And only if new and significant evidence comes to light will the whole case be reopened. Fernando Alonso, however, is not a fan of this decision, as he said in China. He has relatively little understanding for this penalty. He says that 99% of people thought this duel was great and were very entertained in the sprint. And then he gets the harshest penalty handed out in 2 race weekends. So yes, Fernando Alonso versus the stewards, part 734 presumably. Of course, you can find out how it all ends here on Motorsport-Magazin.com. Either enter it the old-fashioned way in your browser or download the app for Android and iOS for free. Then you can also activate push notifications. As soon as there is something from the right of review, you will of course receive it on your cell phone, and you'll also get notifications on your phone when something happens at the weekend. We have the second sprint weekend of the 2024 Formula One season, right after the first. New format, no longer completely new, but new updates to the cars, so it's definitely an exciting weekend. It's definitely worth clicking in.